Good morning, everyone. Good morning to participants who are joining from India, and for others, greetings, depending on where you are. So, uh, uh, many of you may be aware of the series of trade policy research and analytics capacity building seminars that we have been doing at Niti Aayog. Um, uh, in this series, we are really excited to have this uh, seminar by Professor Veeramani from IGIDR. The topic is really important in today's context when we not only talk about international trade from multilateral or plurilateral or bilateral terms, but also from a global value chains perspective. So it's not just about exports and imports, but global value chains. I'm really excited to hear from Professor Veeramani. So before he starts the presentation, I will like to give a very brief introduction about him because he has a very impressive CV. So if I have to give a detailed introduction, it will take a long time. I'll give a very brief introduction. So first of all, I've known Professor Veeramani since my PhD days. So when I was doing my PhD, he joined IGIDR as a faculty member, and he actually did his PhD from the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum. And before that, he did MPhil also from there, and he has done Masters in Development Economics from University of Calicut in Kerala. And he has worked extensively in the area of trade. And before joining IGDR, he was at ICRIER, which also happens to be my first place of work after PhD. So we also had a commonality there. And he has actually, in addition to his academic work, which where he has published a number of top journal papers on trade, global value chains, and so on, and also some books he has written on these topics. He has extensively contributed to the policy. Some of his work has been directly used in the budget documents and the economic survey documents. So he has a very impressive not only academic research profile but also policy contributions. So we're really fortunate to have Professor Veeramani here. So Professor Veeramani, the floor is yours. Please go ahead and present. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts and views on this topic. You can take your time, 45 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A discussion. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Badri, for that very kind introduction. And thank you also for giving this opportunity to present my work on global value chains. So let me go straight into the topic. So first, to give some background about why this issue is important in the context of India, is that there is a recent McKinsey Global Institute which was published in 2020, which gives some estimates. It says that between 2023 and 2030, India needs to create at least 90 million new non-farm employment. And that is based upon some estimates that some 60 million new workers will enter the workforce based on the current demographics, and an additional 30 million workers may move from farm work to non-farm sectors. So together, there will be 90 million new jobs need to be created in the non-farm sector. And for creating this level of employment, real GDP should grow by around 8 to 8.5% annually over the next decade. So this is the estimate. So why I am quoting this estimate is because it is important to know, to create jobs, what should be, you need to have GDP growth. But then the question is, what is the potential engine of growth for the next decade, so that we can get that type of GDP, and therefore that can translate into job creation. So when we ask the engine of growth, there are, broadly speaking, two major channels. One is the domestic market, the demand coming from domestic market, and the other one is the export market. Of course, it is a combination of the two, but then there should be one of them which is the main engine. So which one of these can be the main engine of growth so that we can achieve that level of growth? So in this context, there is a recent paper which was a working paper which is available at the Ashoka University website. It is written by Chatterjee and Subramanian. Subramanian is the former economic advisor, Arvind Subramanian. So they say that based on detailed analysis, they say that domestic market cannot be the main engine of Indian growth in the medium term. And the main reason why they say like that is because there is an increasing debt burden of households, firms, and governments, so that investment as well as domestic demand may not be growing very rapidly in the medium term because of the increasing debt burden. So that means we need to use or look at the exports more seriously if we want to achieve 8% or more than 8% growth during this period. And within, when we talk about the export, I want to focus on here two groups of manufacturing industries which offer a major unexploited export opportunity for India. Now, what are these two groups of industry? Broadly speaking, they include, one is the traditional labor-intensive industries, which include garments, footwear, leather, toys, etc. These are the industries where a labor-abundant country like India inherently has a comparative advantage. And these are also industries where global value chains are very much present. And the nature of global value chains that is present in these industries, what is generally termed as described as buyer-driven global value chains, which basically means that there are big brands like you have Adidas, Nike, and all these big brands who create value, who operate at the higher end of the value chain, and then they subcontract manufacturing to developing countries where wage rates are low, like that in Bangladesh, Vietnam, and all that. So that is the buyer-driven global value chain in apparel industry. And the other group of industry, which is not all these
Not able to, we are not able to hear you for some reason.
cannot hear me.
Hmm? I think some issue at your end in your microphone. I think we cannot hear you at all. We can use a headphone or something. Rejoining. Yeah, yeah, please. Yeah, we can rejoin. Last.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear now. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. I think there was some problem here. Yeah. So I was here in, I think when it got disconnected. So you can hear me right now.
Yeah, yeah, we can hear you very well.
Okay. Okay. So there are two groups of industries where India can have a very important export opportunity. One is the traditional labor-intensive industries like apparel, where global value chains are mostly buyer-driven. And the other one is network products, which are high technology products, machineries, computer, mobile phone, and etc. Where the big firms are like Apple, Nokia, or Samsung, all these firms, where global value chains are mostly producer driven. So in these two groups of industries, based on data, on our performance on trade and all that, we can analyze, and there are evidence which shows that we are not doing as much as we can actually do. There is a lot of unexploited potential in these industries. An important thing to note is that in both these industries, global value chains are widely present, and therefore it is important to be part of this global value chain, both buyer driven as well as producer driven value chain, so that these opportunities can be exploited. Now, but that raises an important policy question. The important policy question is the debate about whether we should focus on local linkages, exploiting local linkages for domestic industries versus participation in global value chains, wherein linkages are globally dispersed. So one strategy is to create greater local linkages, so domestic industries would benefit from these kind of domestic linkages that industries create. And the other option is to be part of this global value chain, but when you participate in global value chains, the all linkages that is being created are not local. A part of that, a major part of that linkage would be global linkages. So that raises this important question: which one of these strategies is better? Which would be more gainful from India's point of view in terms of GDP growth, employment generation, etc. So ultimately, which one of these strategy, a strategy based on local linkage versus a strategy based on global linkage, which one would give us greater gains, ultimately depends upon their impact on value added and employment. So we need to understand which one of these two strategies will give us greater gains in terms of value added within the economy as well as domestic job creation. So based on that, we'll have to make an assessment which strategy is better, and that is what I am going to do it here today in today's presentation, to show some kind of estimates to show which one of these is a better strategy from India's point of view. And before coming into that analysis, it is important to distinguish between two types of GVC participation by any country. One is called backward GVC participation, and the other one is called forward GVC participation. Backward participation essentially means when a country use imported inputs to produce for exports. We call it as backward GVC participation. An example is that if India export mobile phones or cars after using imported inputs or imported components and parts for producing these cars or mobile phones, it is called a backward participation. And forward participation means when India export raw materials or intermediate inputs to another country, and in that country, those inputs are used for further processing and export by that country to some other country. So that is forward participation. For example, if India exports aluminum tubing to Taiwan, where it is further used in the production of the bicycle, which is later exported, that is a example of forward participation. Now, literature says that generally backward participation exerts a more robust positive impact on domestic productivity. There is a more recent paper which is cited here, which shows this, makes a comparison between backward and forward participation in terms of their impact on productivity. And then they show that the backward participation is more beneficial in terms of productivity improvement. Now, in this context, the objective of this presentation is to provide evidence based on India's own past data on how India's backward GVC participation can lead to significant employment and output gains for within India. And second one related to that is to provide evidence on how India's inverted tariff structure. So inverted tariff structure essentially means when a country imposes lower tariff rates for a final good, finished good, as compared to the intermediate inputs, we call it as inverted tariff structure. So how India's inverted tariff structure is creating a kind of incentive, a particular kind of incentive where India's participation in global value chain, particularly backward GVC participation, is discouraged because of inverted tariff structure that we are having. So I will provide some estimates of inverted tariff structure and also provide some analysis of how that inverted tariff structure is adversely affecting India's participation in global value chain. So broadly speaking, these are the two main objectives of my presentation. So let me now ask another question: why we are focusing on backward participation? There is also forward participation. So one reason is that India has a comparative advantage in backward GVC participation, essentially because we are a labor abundant country, particularly low skilled labor abundant country. So backward GVC participation, one important component of backward type of backward GVC participation is assembly. So assembly basically means you import parts and components from other country, use Indian labor to produce the final good and then export, like the kind of activities that China used to do earlier and Vietnam doing now, and Bangladesh is doing now the same thing in apparel industry. And the advantage of this kind of involvement in global value chain is that it has a potential to create millions of jobs for India's low-skilled workers. And we know that there is a lot of informal sector, there is a lot of people who are employed in agriculture, surplus labor. So all these issues we need to address, then these labor need to be productively employed. And backward GVC participation is one way of absorbing this excess labor, surplus labor from agriculture and informal sector to the more modern factory sector. So from that point of view, it is a very important part of the strategy. And then we have also many success stories to support why this strategy can be meaningful and how it can be helpful. For example, the high backward participation, particularly in assembly related activities, has been a major driver of China's export growth. And we have seen so many studies which shows how China's actually carry out its export. Most of its exports are processed exports which are being carried out in export processing zones. They are basically assembly. They import parts and components for almost zero tariffs and then add value using Chinese labor, then export with a label made in China. But what is actually made in China is only a very small component, which is the assembly. And then more recently, we have the evidence from Vietnam, which is now doing this type of activities while China is vacating some of the labor-intensive assembly. Vietnam is entering in that stage in a major way, and that is leading to export growth there. And we have also example of Bangladesh, particularly in apparel industry, where Bangladesh import all the intermediate inputs for apparel from India and Pakistan, and then export the final goods to the Western markets. So that is also, and within India also we have examples. We have the recent success story of mobile phone manufacturing in India, and then there are trade data shows a significant export growth of mobile phones. And at the same time, we are importing parts and components which are used for mobile phones. So import of mobile phones parts and components are increasing, and our exports are increasing very significantly. And in that process, we are adding value, domestic value and job creation in the country. So these are some of the success stories, and there are several such things. And also, this is an opportune movement for India because assembly is shifting out of China. Gradually, it is shifting out of China. And that is happening because of various reasons. One is there are labor shortages within China, and there are wages are increasing within China. And there is also geopolitical developments like the US-China trade war and other issues. And after COVID-19, there is a need that was felt among multinational companies to diversify their supply chains rather than depending too much on China. So all these are opportune movement for India. So India has an opportunity to attract multinational enterprises in this context, particularly to do this backward GVC type of engagement assembly in India. And there are some success stories, like Apple now produces 4 models of the iPhones, including iPhone 14, which is its latest model. Now in India, these are manufactured in India through its manufacturing partners like Foxconn, Wistron, and Pegatron. These are the this is happening, and newspaper reports suggest that Apple may move a quarter of iPhone production to India by 2025. And Samsung opened the world's largest mobile factory in Noida. That also we know. And but apart from this mobile success story, there are many other opportunities. It is not just in mobile. There are these type of activities can be expanded in several other industries, which we broadly classify as network products. And mobile phone is just one among them. And in mobile phone, it has been successful because a conducive policy environment was created for its success. So therefore, it led to this recent success that we can see. Now, in order to highlight the gains that we would get from this assembly type of activities, this is an example. And when China manufacture or basically do assembly of an iPod, they basically specialize in assembly, and parts and components are imported from other country. And the estimate shows that the factory gate price of an assembled iPod in 2008 was $144. But out of that $144, only $4 was the Chinese value added. The remaining $140 were the value added created in other countries which were involved in the GVCs. So even though it is written when we buy an iPod made in China, the actual gain for China is just $4 for every iPod that is exported from China. So, however, that doesn't mean that this gain is actually very small, because Apple sold about 54.8 million iPods in 2008. And if almost all these iPods were assembled in China, so from every iPod you get $4. So that will translate into $219 million for China. So the aggregate gains from these, even though the per unit value addition is small, the overall aggregate gain is huge. And China is doing this in a large number of products, not just one iPod. It is doing it in almost every electronics products. So as a result, the aggregate domestic value added that is happening in China is going to be very huge. So we should not be, it is misleading to say that because the value added per unit is very small, therefore the gain is less, is a misleading statement, because what we need to really think about is the overall volume of production. And we are and the scale that is going to happen, because when we are doing assembly, we are doing that assembly for the world market, and the world market is much larger, and therefore the scale effect that is going to happen as a result of this mean that domestic value addition and employment can be quite high. And this is another example, which is iPhone 7. China makes only about $8 0.46 for every iPhone assembly. However, the total Chinese value added is very high, because $8 multiplied by the total number of iPhones sold in the world is the value added, which is quite high for a single country. And there are thousands of such products where China is doing this, and that is what the gain that we are talking about. So when we are part of these GVCs, we are talking about a large scale of production, and that would translate into, in terms of absolute value, a very large domestic value added as well as employment. And then if you think conceptually, like how this gain is arising, so those things are iPhone and iPod are two examples. This is the conceptual underpinning. behind this. So when a country participates in assembly, it essentially means that the country is using imported inputs, components, raw materials, etc. for doing assembly. And as a result of this, the share of foreign value added in
We cannot hear you again, Professor. Just last few seconds.
yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, there is some network issue, I think, here. So that is creating this trouble here. Okay, let me come to the point where. Okay, yeah. So it's fine, right? The slides are
Yeah,
there, right?
yeah, we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when we are importing intermediate inputs, the foreign value added in India's or any other countries, any countries, the share of foreign value added in gross export will increase, and that is happening because you are using imported intermediate goods. So the value added is created in other countries from where we are importing the intermediate goods. But that also alternatively, it also means that the domestic value added, that is DVA, per unit of exports will decline because we are importing intermediate goods from other country, which is a foreign value added, and gross export is nothing but domestic value added plus foreign value added. So together you get the gross exports. So when foreign value added is increasing, that means the domestic value added is falling. And however, because of the scale effect and the productivity effect of producing for the world market, because when you are part of the GVC, you are doing this for the large world market, and that would lead to the scale effect. As a result of this, even though the per unit DVA, the domestic value added, is falling, the aggregate value of export, gross export, would be increasing. And also the aggregate value of domestic value added in dollar terms would also increase. As a result, it is the domestic value added, when it increases, it will also increase the number of jobs that is created within the country. So this is the kind of relationship among these variables. And what we are going to do here, I am going to do here, is that I am going to look at this relationship empirically in the context of India using a panel data. Okay, so I use a panel data on domestic value added, foreign value added, and number of jobs across sectors, number of jobs created, tied to Indian exports across 112 sectors. And these 112 sectors cover, the entire economy, manufacturing, services, as well as primary. And it covers the period 1999, 2002, 2012, 13 period. And I use the input-output method to capture the domestic value added, foreign value added, and all, because there are direct effects as well as there are indirect linkage effects. So we need to capture all that. So we use the input-output table to a time series of input-output table to capture all these measures, domestic value added, foreign value added, and number of jobs tied to Indian exports from all these sectors. And then based on that, you make use of a measure of a sectors or a industries backward GVC participation, which is defined as the ratio of foreign value added to gross exports. And we refer to that ratio as FVAX ratio. So basically, the underlying logic is that the foreign value added means that you are involved in backward GVC participation if foreign value added goes up. Because you are using imported intermediate goods. So if the ratio of foreign value added is high as a ratio of export, then it means a greater involvement in global value chains, particularly backward GVC participation. So the FX ratio measures how much foreign as opposed to domestic value added is generated for a given unit of exports. And if the FX ratio increases, then it means that a country is increasing its participation in GVCs, the backward participation in GVCs. So it is based on that logic that we use that as a measure of an industry's participation in backward GVCs. And we use that as our measure for the purpose. Okay. Now, before coming to the regression analysis, this is some data, summary statistics. So if you look at the trend over a long period of time, starting from 1999 to 2012, India's backward GVC participation has gone up. That is not shown in this graph. What is shown in this graph is the more recent trend. Up to 2012, India's backward GVC participation has increased significantly. But after 2012, it started declining. This red line in the first graph is the backward GVC participation indicator, which is basically forward value added, foreign value added divided by gross exports of India. And we see that from around 2012, there is a decline in the foreign in the backward GVC participation in India, whereas in Vietnam we see a significant growth during this period. Not only there is a significant growth, the value, the extent of backward GVC participation by Vietnam is quite high. It is 44%. That means 44% of Vietnam's gross exports represents foreign value added, not domestic value added. So, so that means a much greater involvement in backward GVC participation by Vietnam during this period. On forward GVC participation, again, India, there is a decline from 2012 onwards. But here, India is slightly ahead of Vietnam, but that is expected, because we are exporting a lot of raw materials, basic, iron ore, etc. So that is why we get a slightly higher. But Vietnam is mainly involved in backward GVC participation because that is what a developing country with low wages, abundant surplus labor should be doing more. And now let me get into the regression framework. I will not get into a very detailed discussion of this, which is all available in the published paper from which I have used it. But I will only talk about the main logic here. So there is 3 equations here, and this is a system of equations. There are 3 equations. The first equation is an equation of export from sector J in time T. So, and it is regressed on export from sector J, that is XJT, in time T is regressed on that sector's backward GVC participation. That is FVAX ratio. That is the main variable of interest. Other variables are control variables. The control variable includes some domestic activity variable, the YD, and some relative price variable, which is exchange rate adjusted relative price in India and our trading and the world, adjusted for exchange rate, just to capture price competitiveness. and the YD is a domestic activity variable, and then there is also world demand, that is WD in the same sector J and time T, and then we include all industry dummies, industry fixed effects, and time fixed effects. So that is the first equation. That is an equation on a regression of gross exports. The second equation is the domestic value added from each sector when it is exporting. How much is the domestic value added? That is estimated from the using that input-output methodology, which captures both the direct domestic value added as well as the indirect domestic value added in a given sector. Like, for example, when India is exporting automobile, domestic value addition is happening not only in the automobile sector, but also in other sectors from which automobile buy its inputs. Like, for example, addition will happen also in iron and steel sector, or in leather sector or plastic sector, because they are contributing inputs to automobile sector. So this captures the entire aggregate value addition, direct plus indirect value addition. So domestic value added in sector J, that is DVA, and that is regressed on gross exports. So if gross export goes up, then domestic value added will also go up. So that is what is being hypothesized there. And there also we have a domestic activity variable and a relative price variable, sector dummies and time dummies. The third equation is the employment equation, employment in each sector J, which is attributed to export. So that is estimated again using an input-output methodology. The total employment, which is attributed to exports from a sector, which includes both direct and indirect employment that is created as a result of export from a sector, that is regressed on the DVA. That is the dependent variable in the second equation. So when the domestic value added in a sector increases, total employment generated in that sector as a result of DVA increase will also increase. And that also includes some domestic activity variable, some relative price variable, wage rates, labor to output ratio, sector dummies, and time dummies, etc. So our main variable or parameters of interest are alpha 1, beta 1, and gamma 1. So this is based on the framework I showed earlier. Like, when you participate more in global value chain, backward GVC participation, your FVAX ratio increases. And when your FVAX ratio increases, gross export would increase. That would mean alpha 1 will be positive. And when your gross export increases, your domestic value added in the sector will also increase. That would mean beta 1 will be positive and significant. And then when your domestic value added from a sector increases, employment generated in that sector will also increase. That is, the gamma 1 will be positive. So we estimate different variants of these equations, sometimes using lagged dependent variable on the right-hand side, first differences, levels, various combinations of and different variants of these three equations have been estimated using different estimation methods, not just one method, just to show that our results are consistent across specifications and methods, etc. And there is a econometric issues which need to be handled here, because there could be endogeneity issues because of simultaneity, right? The dependent variable in one equation is the independent variable in the other one. There is reverse causality. There could be omitted variables and all that. So our econometric approach addresses these problems in different ways. One is that we use a system GMM method where we treat endogenous variables, some variables as other variables as exogenous, and then use the instrumental variable, which is the lagged values of the endogenous variable is used as instruments. So that is one approach. And the other one is we use a simultaneous equation model approach using 3 SLS, 3-stage least square. That is used. And then we do also regressions in levels and first differences. And then we also use some external instruments. The system GMM uses the internal instrument. That means the lagged values of the endogenous variables are used as instruments. They are called internal instruments. But in addition to that, we also consider some external instruments which are correlated with the FVAX ratio, but not correlated with the outcome variables. So we use all that, and I am not going to the details of all that because that would involve a lot of discussion, and therefore I am skipping that. But this is all available in a published paper. And therefore, I just report here the main findings. The main finding is that greater backward participation by India leads to higher absolute level of gross exports, domestic value added, and employment. And this finding is robust across specifications, whichever method you do, addressing endogeneity, using external instruments, internal instruments, and all that. So that finding is quite robust. There are benefits, and also the relevant elasticities are not very small; they are quite big. So that means that we are not talking about a small gain. It's actually a big gain if we can actually get involved in it. And so it means that basically the positive scale and productivity effects outweigh any possible negative impact of GVC participation. Now, this also raises another important question from a policy point of view, whether backward GVC participation imply that we may stuck at the lower end of the production process, because people don't like assembly. Because we say that if you are doing assembly, it is a kind of considered as not so good because you are getting only very small value added from assembly. So does that mean that we will always get stuck at that very low level value added activities? But this concern is very much there, but the evidence show that this is unwarranted. This concern is unwarranted because there are evidence from a number of countries that have transitioned up from basic manufacturing into more sophisticated form of GVC over the years. There is a World Bank report on this, World Development Indicators, the World Development Report exclusively on GVC. They show a lot of evidence, and we also know how China has now upgraded. Like they entered into very low-end assembly, labor-intensive assembly earlier, making toys and garments and all. Now they upgraded. They technologically they progressed within the GVCs. So they are moving up in the value chain. So there are evidences from different countries that countries do not get stuck at the low end, but that is a way a beginning can be done, like made, and then gradually move upwards. So that is what evidence show from various countries. Now I come to the next important topic. What should be the policy if you want to? So there are gains that can be captured by participating in GVCs, particularly assembly type of business, assembly type of GVC participation. Now, there are various aspects of policy. I am not talking about every aspects of policy, but I am here talking about one important necessary aspect of policy, because it is important that we have to give the right price signals to the investors or the foreign firms so that we can exploit these opportunities. So that means that we need to focus on tariff policy. So it is very clear that import tariff rates for intermediate inputs should be zero or it should be negligible. So if you maintain a very high import tariff for intermediate inputs, parts and components, etc., we cannot be an attractive location for foreign companies, multinational companies, to come here and do assembly here. So they need to import intermediate goods and parts and components from all over the world and then add value here. So that is the objective. Now, if you keep the intermediate goods tariffs high, then that will not make make these companies to come here. So that is important. And apart from that, there is another issue: the issue of inverted tariff, and that is a problem in India. There are evidence which I am going to show. That is a one important problem in India. And this inverted tariff exists when the duty rate for the overall finished good is lower than the duty rate for the component parts. So if the final goods attract lower duty, then it makes sense to import the final good from other countries rather than manufacturing it domestically. Because if you are manufacturing it domestically, you pay import duties for intermediate goods, and that makes it increases the cost of producing the final good domestically. So it makes sense to import final good rather than manufacture final good domestically when there are inverted tariff. So that type of a structure would render the relevant manufacturing process uncompetitive. And this is a serious issue for what we call the network products, because as part of India's information technology agreement under the WTO, import tariffs on information technology products have been brought down to very low level, and they are final products. Most of them are final products. But the tariffs on some of the intermediate inputs, which are used in the IT products or network products, they remain high. So therefore, we end up importing the final goods rather than doing the domestic assembly here. And when this is corrected, in such cases, we have evidence that the domestic manufacturing is taking place in India. Mobile phone is a good example. And when Apple wanted to come to India to do assembly, the demand that they made is that tariffs on intermediate goods should be abolished. Right. So as a result, we are seeing what is happening in the mobile phone industry. The same thing can be repeated, like if you do it in other sectors also. Okay, so now this is the comparison of tariff rates, overall tariff rates in India, China, and Vietnam. We see that Indian tariffs, which is the red line, is higher than that in both China and Vietnam. And it is higher not just in aggregate, but also if you separate commodities into intermediate inputs and final consumer goods also. Indian tariffs are higher, both intermediate goods and final goods, compared to that in China and Vietnam. And these are some of the examples of tariff increases that happened in the recent times. Particularly for parts and components, which are used in network products. We have a lot of these examples, these are all different network products components. These are parts and components, not the final product. And we see tariff increases, many of these in 2019-20 budget, and in 2020-21 budget also we see an increase in tariff. But in the last budget, that is 2022-23 budget, a reverse process can be seen. Like, there is some understanding that these need to be corrected. So whatever products for which tariffs are increased in the last budget, most of them are final goods. And for intermediate goods, they were brought down. So there is some rationalization that is taking place. And it is important that this will continue so that this opportunity can be exploited. So the simple idea is that identify all products which are intermediate goods and parts and component at the HS level, bring down their tariffs. It is okay to increase tariff for final goods. That is fine, because that will not lead to inverted tariff situation. So if you want to correct inverted tariff, it is important that we identify all HS codes that are primarily used for industrial purpose, and then bring down their tariffs. And if at all tariffs have to be increased, that has to be increased for those HS codes which are primarily used for household level consumption. Okay, so now we also make a measurement of inverted tariff to see how much inverted tariff exists. And so basically inverted tariff exists when the input tariff rate for an industry I is greater than the output tariff for industry I. So it is simply a ratio. We can calculate a ratio of input tariff to output tariff. And if this ratio is greater than 1, then we say that there is inverted tariff. If the ratio is greater than 1, it means that the input tariffs are higher than output tariff for the given sector. And these are again calculated using input-output table, supply use table, detailed data on tariffs at the HS level and all that. So I'm not getting into the details of methodology, and get into some estimates for network products. So this shows the tariff inversion. Tariff inversion in terms of output tariff, input tariff, then tariff inversion is the ratio of input tariff to output tariff. These are some of the network products where there are significant global value chains. And we see that in most of them, we have an inverted tariff. The ratio is equal to 1 or greater than 1. And this is another manufacturer of machinery and equipment. Again, we see an inverted tariff problem. Manufacturer of electronic components, so on, consumer electronics, again, we see there is an inverted tariff problem. The only network products where we do not have an inverted tariff problem is the transport equipment. And this is one sector where India is doing well also. We know that we are exporting automobile, right, and cars, and we don't have an inverted tariff issue there, except in the last year, there is also some evidence that it is happening in 2019-20. So we see from here, like, our GVC participation is not going up also because of this problem that need to be addressed. And do other countries have this problem? If you compare with China, the inverted tariff measurement, we see that China does not have this issue. So their tariff ratio is always less than 1. India's ratio is above 1. And finally, this is my final slide. So what we do is that we do a simple regression analysis. Again, the dependent variable is a export to output ratio in each sector, as well as the country's GVC participation index, that is foreign value added divided by gross export ratio. So we do 2 regressions and then regress them on tariff inversion. And we find that, when tariff inversion exists, then tariff inversion reduces export to output ratio in a panel of Indian industries, controlling for industry fixed effects, time fixed effect and all. Similarly, inversion reduced India's GVC participation by Indian industries. So this is the my presentation. I will conclude here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Veerumani. It was a really enlightening presentation. And in fact, we have also been discussing among the policymakers about the need for fixing the inverted duty structure, reducing the input tariffs, and so on. So it's very nice to see all the evidence that you produce for that. We're also looking at effective rate of protection as also a measure, like similar to what you mentioned in terms of tariff inversion. I think I have just a couple of questions. One is on the methodology. It's just a very brief clarificatory question. So when you mentioned system GMM estimation, I think it is you're talking about the Blundell and Bond, right? Blundell and Bond 2000. Okay. So, and the other aspect is that when you the results from the analysis, they suggest that backward integration with in terms of imports are going to be beneficial to plug into the global value chains. And the reason why we have not contributed a lot to the global value chains is because of lack of backward integration, right? Yes. So if we look at a longer time series, if we start from the let's say 1960s or 70s till now, do you think? Of course, I'm not asking if we have done that, but conceptually, do you think there could have been a greater integration of India with the global value chains given the longer time horizon? Previously, we are not playing any role, but now we are playing some role. So I think that kind of evidence also will be helpful. Apart from stating that yes, we are not doing so well right now. We have a lot of potential, but some gains that we have made in the past would also be very instructive on saying that these are not concepts that are from the trade theory and empirics from other countries, but also even in our own country we have seen this, that we have had a lot of gains in terms of GVC integration in the past, maybe in the 90s or in the 80s when we reduced tariffs. So any thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely. Like, there are clear gains, and in my paper, I actually showed that from 1999 onwards, and during these 90s and 2000, particularly in 2000s, the decade of 2000, there is a very significant growth of integration in the GVCs, which was not there earlier. Like, we were much less integrated in the 80s and 90s, but during the 2000s, 2002 around 2012. That is the time. Till that period, there is a very significant growth, and after that, it kind of flattened, and then there is some little bit of decline. That is what is happening in recent years. But then there was a significant growth up to the year 2012. That's what I find.
Thank you, Professor. Any other questions from my colleagues? Yeah. Yeah. Maybe you can first ask here. You have. Yeah. Do you have any questions? Okay. No. Aparna, any questions? Maybe chat we can see. Chat ko dekhe. Chat. I think there is some question or comment on chat.
Yeah. There is some Sonia raised something.
Yeah, our colleague actually.
So
maybe please unmute Mrs. Sonia Pan. Yes, Sonia, you are. Please unmute. Yeah, you're on. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Thank you. There was a problem on the chat saying that I'm not able to unmute myself, and you have to unmute me to make it to enable it. So thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Veeramani, for a very good presentation, and it made a lot of sense. And I'm looking forward to read your paper as well on this issue. I had a policy question, not really related to what you're saying, and I fully agree with the inverted duty structure and the need to change it so that we get integrated into the global value chain, especially for the ITA products, and possibly also getting into ITA 2. India is not yet a part of ITA 2. So all those points I agree, but what I wanted to ask you was that if you look at the production-linked incentive scheme under the Atmanirbhar Bharat project, which we have, so the PLI is looking at this issue from a different angle. So they are like, fiscal subsidy-induced manufacturing, a promotion in India. So what is your view on, policy initiatives like PLI, and how would they impact the GVC participation? And would you think a better way would still be to go ahead and, address it from the tariff point of view rather than from enhancing production through a fiscal incentive like PLI?
Yeah, so there is already some, based on my presentation, we can already see some success stories based on PLI. For example, the Apple assembly that is happening in iPhone assembly that is happening in India, they have benefited. These companies like Foxconn and all these companies who are manufacturing this for Apple, they have availed benefits from. They are going to avail benefits from PLI. So they have already reached their target, and the third company has not yet reached, but they are also trying. So there are some evidence that this is working from the point of view of integrating India into the GVCs. But then we also need to the Apple success story is partly it is PLI, because of the PLI which provide that fiscal incentives, but also they had a conducive trade policy also. There are no issues in getting intermediate inputs for them. So our imports of intermediate inputs has gone up very significantly in mobile manufacturing. So tariffs are reduced, brought down, and therefore it cannot be PLI alone may not be effective. So you will have to do it along with the trade policy. The trade policy is very clear. You need to have if you want to participate and benefit from this, we cannot opt a trade policy which will have a higher tariffs for parts and components. So that has to be brought down.
Thank you. Also, if I can ask a follow-up, Badri. Yeah, thank you. So, Professor, one more thing I wanted to ask, that if you read the GVC literature, what you see is that may not be related to the India story. This question may not be related to the India story, but in the GVC literature, you see that increasing use of services, in manufacturing, in bundling services with goods, in terms of differentiating the product or increasing the brand loyalty of the customers towards that product is happening. And that increasing use of services in production, in manufacturing, is happening probably towards the higher end of the value chain. So I think, so what is your view on that, considering India is seen as a services powerhouse in terms of its contribution to GDP, as well as the exports that happen from India, and how Indian services get integrated into the products of European countries or US IT products. So how do you think can that kind of integration happen in case of Indian manufacturing? Which is now
Yeah, so the study that I have published, this has come out in a journal called Review of World Economics. So, and this is also an earlier version of this is an Exim Bank of India occasional paper. So both these studies papers, they show that the service sector actually benefited. What you said is exactly correct. Indian service sector has benefited from manufacturing export growth. So when India is exporting manufacturing, it is not just jobs are created not just in manufacturing. They are also created in services. They are also created in the primary agriculture sector. If you export apparel, jobs can be created in the agriculture sector. Similarly, there are lots of jobs which are created in the services sector because of the backward linkage. Manufacturing sector has a strong backward linkage with the services. So a manufacturing oriented growth strategy wherein we participate in this kind of global value chains doesn't mean that we are keeping services out. Services will become a part of that story. Because there are several services inputs which are needed for these manufacturing to pick up. So this discussion, whether it is manufacturing or services, I think that is not a very meaningful discussion, right? They are all interrelated, the two sectors. But it is more interrelated. The manufacturing to service linkage is much stronger than services to manufacturing linkage. That's what we see. There's a much stronger linkage from manufacturing to services than the vice versa.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think Dr. Raymond Davis has a comment or question. Raymond, would you like to talk, or maybe the chat is enough? Yeah, please go ahead. Nice to see you after a long time.
Thank you, Badri. I really appreciate it. What a wonderful presentation, and thank you very much, Professor. Do you see part of the future, though, where we're going to characterize localized value chains for regional and localized capture, particularly working with some free where we can, particularly in the SME side of things, to really exploit that localized ecosystems, and how that might change some of your data and really accelerate some of that data as well. I'd love to hear your.
Yeah, I think I got your question correctly. There was some disturbance in between, but I think I got what you are asking. So if you look at the success story from India, which is automobile, the car manufacturing and export. We have been exporting, these small and compact cars, and that is a success story. And then part of that success story is that we opened up the sector for full foreign direct investment in the 2000, around the year 2000. So all foreign brands, big multinational companies, they all came in India. They started manufacturing in India, and when they arrived here, the entire local ecosystem also came up. like the auto ancillaries, parts and components manufacturing firms, many of them are domestic, and some of these companies, the Indian companies, became world-class suppliers of components for automobile industry. So again, this fear that when you open up it for foreign companies, then it will drive out domestic companies. I think there is no evidence for that. At least in the case of automobile industry, there is no evidence for that. And also we know from East Asian countries that small firms, medium and small firms can coexist with the large firms, because they have these kind of that synergy can be, some symbiotic relationships can be established between small, medium, and large. So you cannot have only small firms, because it is not possible. You need to have large firms so that small firms can survive.
Do you see any future in actually measuring that, metrics to that, as well as your forward-backward approaches?
Yeah, so I didn't look at this forward-backward approach in terms of firms, but at the industry level, we see that there is a lot of this forward linkage from different sectors, which may have informal, large informal sector presence. So these informal sector provide inputs to the formal sector, and if the formal sector expands, then informal sector benefits. So it is not the when one expands, the other goes away. That doesn't but there is a fear that that might happen. But when you think in terms of linkages, in terms of backward forward linkages, I don't think that fear is justified, because we have a good example from automobile, where very small auto ancillary firms are coexisting with large firms.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raymond, for the question, and also for answering, and also for Sonia for the great questions. So, in fact, I would also like to add to what you said in terms of the PLI and trade policy. So, we also looked at some of the data, looking at inputs and so on. And we also found out that some of the input tariffs have been on the rise, and like you also rightly said, in the very recent budgets, many of them have been corrected actually. So, so in order to, so if you want to incentivize production, we also have to keep the input cost low, and we cannot increase the cost. So, and that, and many times that can be imports. And also one more thing, I think, which also I think you mentioned at some point, is that the global value chains are extremely complex and complicated. So you cannot actually say that maybe you're importing one intermediate product and exporting another intermediate product, adding some value and exporting another intermediate product, and then that is then added, value is added to that somewhere else, and that then comes back to you, and then you make a finished product. So it's not like a older way of thinking, of black and white thinking, that this is an intermediate product, this is a finished product, this is a capital good. So products can take different avatars, so to say. So I think that's one aspect, and that is why sometimes I also have difficulty in making the clear-cut classifications. How can we say that this is intermediate? Because what is intermediate for one company can be final for somebody else. So that is also an important aspect to be considering, and that is also kind of adding to your argument that since the global value chains are so complex, it's not a simple game of you're importing everything and assembling here, but you're participating at different stages of the value chain, global value chain. So that's a great thing. And also another point you mentioned about, also Sonia raised about interaction or linkages between services and goods. In fact, we have also seen in some of our other studies when you're looking at the impact assessment of the ongoing free trade agreements, we see a lot of synergies. Even when you just do tariff liberalization, reduce tariffs on goods, services sectors actually gain much more even than the goods sectors because of the linkages, like you also rightly mentioned. So I think that's a great point. That the input-output linkages are very strong, so that is another aspect. So I think this was a very enlightening presentation and great discussion also we had today. And unless there are any further questions, I think there's one last comment from I think Dr. Anupam Dalal. Yeah, see that comment or question, and then we can conclude.
Okay, the automobile sector, it is seen it enhances local production. How it will be helpful for agriculture sector? Okay. So if I say one example, like how it can be helpful for agriculture sector if automobile sector export goes up, is that automobile uses tire, right? For manufacturing tire, you need rubber. So the farmers in Kerala would be direct beneficiary of an automobile export from a growth that is happening in the automobile sector, because then you have to buy rubber. Natural rubber is needed for some of the automobiles. So the demand for natural rubber goes up as a result of this. So that is one example of how agriculture sector can also benefit if manufacturing increases.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Actually, another aspect, another way to think about it is that when you have automobile sector expanding, you have employment and wages go up in that sector, and that leads to greater income, and people will purchase more. Maybe they may purchase more premium food products, or maybe even more food, and then agriculture sector can also expand from the income side as well. And also, maybe if the question is about integration of agriculture sector, there also we can think of a lot of channels. We can. I remember one example. Long ago, we were not allowing Michigan apples to come here. We had high tariffs and restrictions because we wanted to protect our Shimla apples. But what happened was when we started opening up, eventually we opened up, it actually led to a lot of synergies between the imported apples and domestic apples, because because of the seasonal differences, the Michigan apples would come in when Shimla apples are not available in the market, and that led to some kind of continuity. And then the value chain started getting created. Jams and jellies were manufactured. A lot of value addition started happening. You had enough volume, enough demand for that. Starting from the imports, which also adds value to the domestic agriculture. So I think that could be another way of looking at it if she's talking about opening up agriculture sector for backward integration. So thank you once again, Professor Veeramani, and for all the participants for the great questions. We really had a wonderful discussion, and I'm sure this will add a lot of value to the policy process as well. So thank you. I'm looking forward to collaborations, discussions on GVCs.
Sure.
Thank you.
Looking forward to meeting you.
Yeah, definitely. I'm also looking forward. Thank you. Thank you.